Hello everyone, and welcome to the M.O.W channel. Today, we'll dive into one of the longest and most expensive investigations in FBI history, the Unabomber case. Before we begin, please take a moment to hit subscribe and like, it really helps the channel grow. Now then, let's get started. Viewers, the man we're about to trace is one of the most notorious domestic terrorists in American history. His name Theodore Ted Kaczynski, but the world remembers him better by his codename the Unabomber. Who could have imagined that this quiet, brilliant man would one day paralyze the United States with fear for nearly 2 decades? His story doesn't begin like that of an ordinary criminal. It begins in the mind of a genius, twisted by isolation and ideology into tragic irony. Ted was born in 1942, in Chicago, to a working-class Polish immigrant family. From an early age, he showed extraordinary intelligence. His recorded IQ was 167. He was years ahead of other children and skipped several grades, which made him the youngest and smallest in his classes. While this early acceleration benefited his academics, it left deep scars on his emotional and social development. Ted was bullied and ostracized, unable to connect with his peers. This constant alienation grew into a festering resentment and a lifelong sense of isolation. He became a loner whom society never truly understood. In 1958, at only 16 years old, Ted entered Harvard University to study mathematics. This was the pinnacle of his academic promise, but also the turning point toward his downfall. Harvard offered him intellectual challenge, but socially it was a cold and merciless place. Painfully shy and withdrawn, Ted found himself mocked and ignored by other students. He retreated from human contact and found solace in the abstract world of mathematics. But the most crucial and darkest experience of his Harvard years came when he volunteered for a psychological experiment. The study, conducted by the renowned psychologist Henry Murray, would later be compared to the infamous MK Project, a brutal stress experiment testing human endurance. Participants, including Ted, were asked to write essays about their personal beliefs, only to have those same beliefs viciously attacked and ridiculed in a series of confrontational interviews. Ted endured dozens of hours of psychological abuse during these sessions. The experiment deeply wounded his already fragile psyche, magnifying his social anxiety and persecution complex. He began to ask himself, "Why am I being treated this way?" That question became the seed of his growing paranoia, and it ignited a deep hatred toward technological society and the elite institutions that represented it. This psychological trauma became the core of his later ideology and fueled the rage that would define him as the Unabomber. After Harvard, Ted earned his Ph.D. in mathematics from the University of Michigan, producing an exceptional dissertation on complex analysis that impressed his professors. By 1967, at just 25 years old, he became the youngest assistant professor in the history of UC Berkeley's mathematics department. Had he stayed on this path, Ted might have become a celebrated academic. But during his 2 years at Berkeley, he grew increasingly withdrawn and erratic. He avoided colleagues, struggled to lecture, and seemed detached from reality. Then, in 1969, without explanation, he resigned from his position, walking away from academia and modern society entirely. What followed was an act of complete rejection. In 1971, Kaczynski moved to the remote wilderness near Lincoln, Montana. There, armed only with an axe and a saw, he built a tiny 10 by 12-foot log cabin. No electricity, no running water, no phone. He survived by hunting and foraging, living off the land in isolation. That cabin was not merely a shelter, it was his fortress of ideology, where he wrote his infamous Manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, and began designing homemade bombs as tools of what he called a revolution against technology. In this solitude, his anti-technological philosophy grew extreme. He became convinced that technology enslaved humanity, destroyed the environment, and stripped people of their freedom and dignity. At first, he considered peaceful protest, but when he saw Montana's pristine forests being bulldozed for development, his anger exploded. He concluded that words alone could no longer change the world. So, the genius mathematician turned his intellect toward destruction. Using his knowledge of chemistry and engineering, he crafted bombs that were nearly impossible to trace. Every component was made from scavenged materials, deliberately chosen so that investigators could not determine their origin. On May 25, 1978, his first bomb detonated. A professor at Northwestern University opened a mailed package, triggering an explosion. Though the damage was limited, it marked the beginning of a 17-year campaign of terror that would claim lives, maim victims, and baffle the FBI for nearly 2 decades. At that time, no one, not even the most experienced investigators, could have imagined that behind these attacks was a reclusive mathematical genius who once walked the halls of Harvard and Berkeley. After the first explosion in Chicago in 1978, The United States endured 17 years of terror at the hands of an invisible adversary. This was not a simple series of crimes. It was a highly intelligent form of technological terrorism, born from the philosophical hatred of a single individual. The FBI immediately launched a massive investigation. In response to this anonymous threat, the operation was codenamed UNABOM, derived from the first letters of the initial target's university, airline, and M.O.W. In 1979, the FBI formed a dedicated UNABOM task force. This team was led by the FBI and included specialists from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives ATF and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. At its peak, the task force consisted of more than 150 full-time personnel, making it one of the largest domestic investigations in FBI history. UNABOM became the most expensive, personnel-intensive, and longest unsolved case in the Bureau's history. Investigators threw everything they had into the case, but they were not facing an ordinary criminal. Kaczynski was always one step ahead of the investigation. It was as if he had an uncanny understanding of FBI procedures and psychological profiling techniques, erasing every trace of his presence with meticulous precision. As the investigation progressed, the technical sophistication of his bombs increased, and the Unabomber seemed to taunt the authorities with each new attack. Every explosion deepened the investigators' frustration. The greatest challenge for the FBI was the nature of the explosives themselves. David Kaczynski created his bombs with artistic craftsmanship. Each device was handcrafted, with materials carefully chosen to foil forensic analysis. Narration transition images of bomb debris appear on screen. First, he relied on scrap materials. Every part of the bomb fuses, casings, switches, even screws was sourced from discarded waste or everyday items. For example, bomb casings were made from wood or metal pipes, while the explosives themselves were repurposed from fireworks or common chemicals. This made it impossible for the FBI to use trace analysis to track purchases or manufacturers. At bomb sites, only ordinary metal fragments and wood scraps remained. Second, there was perfect evidence concealment. Kaczynski wore gloves throughout the packaging and mailing process, and intentionally treated every surface that might retain fingerprints during detonation. Over 17 years, the FBI never recovered a single usable fingerprint or DNA sample from any of his bombs or packages. This level of meticulousness was virtually unimaginable at the time. Investigators realized that the perpetrator was not only highly intelligent, but also lived a solitary, disciplined life, entirely devoted to his crimes. Despite the lack of decisive forensic evidence, Kaczynski left a kind of signature in his bombs. Repeatedly, investigators found components marked with the initials FC. The FBI speculated that this could stand for Freedom Club, or it might simply be a personal mark representing the bomber himself. Bomb experts interpreted the initials as reflecting the Unabomber's strong sense of identity and desired to communicate a message. Additionally, the handcrafted screws and metal plates suggested that he worked with limited tools, much like in his remote Montana cabin, rather than using professional workshop equipment. The FBI began constructing a profile. He was likely a lone individual living in isolation, obsessively spending long periods creating these complex devices. Their initial profile assumed a skilled technician or mechanic, but over time, it evolved into that of a highly educated intellectual, because only genius-level intelligence, combined with obsessive perfectionism, could explain his ability to elude capture for so long. While constructing such sophisticated bombs, the Unabomber's choice of targets further complicated the investigation. His attacks were not motivated by revenge or money, but by symbolic significance. Early targets included university professors, engineers, and airline executives, individuals at the forefront of technological society, reflecting his anti-technology philosophy. As the attacks continued, his targets expanded to include advertising executives and forestry lobbyists, demonstrating that he considered any profession contributing to industrial society and environmental destruction as enemies. Because there was no personal connection among the victims, investigators had to analyze the bomber's psychology based solely on the victims' professions and symbolic value. Every time a bomb exploded, the FBI arrived on site, collected debris, sifted through thousands of tips, and painstakingly narrowed down suspects. Yet each time, the bomber vanished like a ghost, leaving the investigators feeling as if they were chasing shadows. Over the course of 17 years, FBI files on the case piled up, and public anxiety soared. Investigators realized that to solve this mystery, they needed a decisive event, something that would force the Unabomber to reveal himself to the world. Finally, in 1995, that moment arrived. The beta-lengthy Manifesto, filled with his ideology and twisted worldview, which he himself made public. In 1995, After 17 years of terrorizing the United States, the Unabomber changed his approach. He no longer relied solely on mailed bombs outside the reach of the FBI's investigation. He unveiled an even more powerful weapon: his ideology. That summer, lengthy letters arrived at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and several other media outlets. The sender was none other than FC, the mysterious initials he had left on his bomb components. The letters contained chilling threats. The newspapers were to publish his 35,000-word essay, a manifesto, in full, or he would continue his deadly attacks. The document, delivered to the press, was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. Its contents were shocking. This was not the ramblings of a lunatic. It was a logical, systematic argument, claiming that technological progress would inevitably destroy human freedom. Kaczynski argued that society must dismantle technological systems and return to a primitive way of life. His demand placed the FBI and the Department of Justice in an unprecedented ethical dilemma. If the government and media complied and published the manifesto, it would set a dangerous precedent, giving into terrorism and signaling to future terrorists that threats work. FBI directors and the Attorney General wrestled with the conflict between national security and the responsibility of the press. Conversely, refusing his demands risked further loss of life. After 17 years of bombings with countless victims, the Unabomber's threat could not be taken lightly. The investigative team faced immense pressure. The UNABOM task force held multiple secret meetings to resolve the situation. They analyzed Kaczynski's writing style and ideology, but there were still too few clues to determine his true identity. Ultimately, they decided to try a dramatic reverse strategy. The Department of Justice and the FBI concluded that public safety was paramount. In consultation with the media, they agreed to publish the manifesto in full. This decision may have seemed like a temporary victory for the terrorist, but for the FBI, it was part of a long-term investigative strategy. They believed the manifesto itself was a clue left by the perpetrator. The FBI's plan was simple: let millions of readers see this document, and wait for the one person who recognizes similarities between the writing and someone they know, a family member, friend, or acquaintance, to come forward. Through this vast public appeal, they hoped to provoke a confession from someone close to the elusive Unabomber, who had evaded capture for 17 years. In September 1995, The Washington Post and The New York Times jointly printed the 52-page manifesto in full. This was an unprecedented act in journalistic history. Millions of Americans read the shocking text, stunned by its content. While some intellectuals debated his fierce critique of technological society, for most people, the primary question remained: who was this bomber? Immediately after the publication, the UNABOM task force fundamentally shifted its investigative approach. They no longer relied solely on bomb debris or mail tracking. Now, the most critical evidence was language itself. The FBI urgently deployed experts in stylometry, a forensic field focused on identifying authors by linguistic fingerprints. Every person has a unique writing style and idiosyncrasy. In Kaczynski's manifesto, experts identified several distinctive features: unique vocabulary, repeated use of archaic or scholarly terms, non-standard grammatical structures, unusual patterns in conjunctions and relative pronouns, punctuation habits, distinctive frequency and use of dashes and colons, deviating from common patterns, modifiers and tone, subtle linguistic cues expressing arrogance, intense condemnation, and a sense of personal genius. Investigators meticulously compared the manifesto with thousands of tips and writing samples from past suspects. This was a painstaking, time-consuming psychological game. Amid countless dead ends, they searched for a single voice: the linguistic fingerprint. Revealing the Unabomber's true identity, by publishing the manifesto, the FBI executed a dangerous but brilliant gamble. For the first time, Kaczynski succeeded in spreading his ideology to the public, but he also exposed the most critical clue for his own capture. The investigation transformed from analyzing bomb debris into an intellectual pursuit, chasing the identity hidden within the genius and writing style of a masterful, reclusive mind. In September 1995, when the Unabomber's manifesto was published in newspapers across the United States, the FBI embarked on an unprecedented gamble, a public manhunt aimed at millions of readers. And then, at an unexpected moment, the long-awaited clue finally fell into the investigators' hands. This clue did not come from cutting-edge technology or sophisticated investigative techniques. It came from the tragic conscience of family. Ted Kaczynski's brother, David Kaczynski, was deeply shocked upon reading the manifesto. Although he had been estranged from Ted for many years, The intense anti-technology ideology and distinctive writing style lingered in his mind. David instinctively realized that the sentences in the Manifesto bore an uncanny resemblance to the unique stylistic and vocabulary patterns Ted had used in letters and academic materials sent to the family years earlier. David, together with his wife Linda Kaczynski, secretly reviewed letters and essays Ted had written decades before. They were not professional analysts, but they undertook the painful task of identifying the Unabomber through the writings of a beloved family member. Linda noted that rare words and phrases like coolly and puerile, which Ted had used in his past writings, appeared repeatedly in the Manifesto as well. This was no coincidence, it was the author's linguistic fingerprint. For David, this discovery was a kind of hell. The unbearable weight of realizing that the brother he loved might be the serial bomber who had killed and injured innocent civilians for 17 years was overwhelming. He faced a torturous ethical dilemma: allow his brother to continue, risking more victims, or turn him into the authorities. Protecting Ted meant condoning further deaths. Ultimately, David made the agonizing decision that he had to stop further suffering and, through a lawyer, submit an anonymous tip to the FBI. He secretly requested that the FBI not seek the death penalty. When arresting his brother, the FBI received thousands of tips every day. But the information submitted through David's attorney was different. FBI stylometry experts compared Ted's past writings with the Manifesto, applying the linguistic patterns they had identified in earlier analyses. The results were overwhelming. It was highly probable that Ted Kaczynski authored the Manifesto, meaning the elusive ghost they had been pursuing for 17 years was, shockingly, a former Harvard-educated mathematics professor. The task force initiated operations in utmost secrecy. The information was so critical that the FBI implemented complete security and surveillance measures to ensure Ted did not suspect his exposure. Within the UNABOM task force, only a handful of core agents were aware of the information. They launched a covert operation around Ted Kaczynski's cabin on the outskirts of Lincoln, Montana, codenamed Unabomber. The FBI needed to arrest Ted Kaczynski in the act. They knew he was not a harmless recluse, but a highly skilled bomber capable of detonating explosives at any moment. Agents observed the terrain and monitored Ted's routines for several days. With no electricity or telephone in the cabin, his ability to communicate or defend himself was extremely limited. On April 3, 1996, the day of the operation arrived. The FBI planned to apprehend Ted while he was outside the cabin and unarmed. The strategy was a low-profile arrest. Dozens of tactical agents were covertly positioned in the forest, but only one agent would carry out the arrest. FBI agent Gary L. O'Neill approached the cabin in disguise, pretending to survey the land surrounding it. Ted Kaczynski was startled and confused by the intrusion, but after 17 years of fugitive life, he seemed too fatigued or perhaps too isolated to anticipate contact with outsiders. He offered no resistance. The Unabomber, who had terrorized the United States for 17 years, was arrested quietly in front of his remote Montana cabin. There was no gunfire, no struggle. Even as handcuffs were applied, he appeared to not fully comprehend why he was being arrested. Immediately after the arrest, the FBI searched the cabin and secured critical evidence. Inside, they discovered a highly organized bomb-making workshop filled with tools, chemicals, and unfinished bomb components. The most decisive piece of evidence was a fully assembled, functional bomb found next to Kaczynski's bed. This bomb was intended to be mailed imminently, and the FBI confirmed that the arrest directly prevented further loss of life. Additionally, thousands of pages of Kaczynski's manuscripts were found, including the original typescript of Industrial Society and its future and detailed journals of his criminal activities. The journals contained meticulous records of each bomb's construction, shipping dates, and even the names of his victims. These materials constituted an indisputable, irrefutable smoking gun. In the end, 17 years of pursuit concluded thanks to a family's tragic tip and the FBI's meticulous covert operation. This climactic moment was a tragic drama, the madness of a genius, the relentless pursuit of the government, and the conscience of a family converged and finally brought the saga to an end. In April 1996, with the arrest of Ted Kaczynski at his Montana cabin, 17 years of terror from mail bombs finally came to an end. The FBI had won, but the story was far from over. Now, the former Harvard mathematics professor faced another battlefield, the courtroom. Families of the numerous victims and the FBI demanded the death penalty, and the prosecution was ready to seek it. However, this trial was not about whether the Unabomber was guilty. His journals and bomb-making evidence had already confirmed his crimes. The real focus of the court battle was his mental state, whether Ted Kaczynski was legally responsible for his actions and possessed a sound mind. Against the prosecution's strong push for the death penalty, Kaczynski's court-appointed defense attorneys presented a mental illness defense. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. The defense argued that his irrational anti-technology ideology, extreme seclusion, and 17 years of meticulously planned crimes were manifestations of his mental illness, aiming to spare him the death penalty and seek life imprisonment instead. But Kaczynski vehemently rejected this strategy. To him, reducing his actions to the symptoms of a mental disorder was to invalidate the Manifesto. He had spent his life creating industrial society and its future. He insisted that he was not insane, that his ideas were entirely logical and rational, and that society simply could not comprehend them. Being labeled as mentally ill would reduce his philosophy to the ramblings of a madman, rendering his message meaningless. Kaczynski saw this as the cruelest revenge that the very system he despised could enact against him. He refused to cooperate with his lawyers and even requested to represent himself. When denied, he exhibited extreme behavior, including courtroom outbursts and suicide attempts in prison. The trial evolved into a bizarre and tragic psychological drama, where genius and paranoia clashed in the public eye. The courtroom chaos and Kaczynski's instability threatened to derail the trial. After lengthy discussions, the prosecution and defense reached a plea bargain, in which the death penalty would be abandoned in exchange for a guilty plea. In May 1998, Ted Kaczynski pleaded guilty to 16 federal bombings and murder charges. He was sentenced to 4 life sentences without parole, plus an additional 30 years, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. In this way, Kaczynski quietly succumbed to the very system he had despised. The Unabomber case concluded without the extremity of the death penalty, yet the debate over his ideology and criminal acts persisted. After sentencing, Kaczynski was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, the United States' highest security supermax prison, reserved for the most dangerous and notorious inmates. There, he spent decades isolated in a small cell, completely cut off from the outside world. This was ironically reminiscent of the self-imposed isolation he had chosen at his Montana cabin. But now it was enforced by the system. Even in prison, Kaczynski attempted to communicate writings and philosophical ideas with the outside world. He never expressed remorse or apologized. To him, the violence had been a necessary evil. In his mission to save humanity, his life remained driven entirely by hatred of technological civilization and an obsessive commitment to opposing it. In June 2023, Ted Kaczynski died in custody at the age of 81. His long and violent life had ended, but his legacy continues to haunt American society. What became of the Montana cabin, the symbolic center of Kaczynski's operations? The FBI dismantled the cabin and transported it to FBI headquarters, where it was reassembled and displayed as a monumental piece of investigative history. The remote cabin where bombs had been meticulously crafted for 17 years now stood under the control of the system, symbolizing the FBI's triumph over terrorism. Yet the more complex and enduring legacy is his ideology. Kaczynski's heinous crimes are indefensible and must be condemned. However, the questions he raised in his manifesto, does the technological system undermine human autonomy and deepen social isolation, have resurfaced in the 21st century, in the age of AI and hyperconnected society. While Kaczynski used bombs to capture the world's attention, in the end, it is his ideas alone that remain, posing uncomfortable truths to modern society. We must condemn the violence of a terrorist, yet we are also challenged to confront the twisted warnings that lie behind that violence. The story of the Unabomber is not merely the fall of a genius. It is an ongoing question about the technological civilization we inhabit. That concludes today's story. How did you find it? Tomorrow, we will explore a new case. Make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to watch the next video first.